Ru Campbell, thanks very much for joining me today. How are you?
Thanks for the invitation, David. I'm doing really well, thank you.
So, why don't we clean our palettes and just walk me through memory lane? You know, your technologies today, MVP in cyber, Microsoft. Talk to me about what was that journey like?
Sure. So I've been in the industry for over a decade now. I look at the calendar. I've been working full-time in IT for 12 years, specializing in cybersecurity for coming up half of those years. Prior to that, I was an IT manager. And now I'm a full-time security architect, and I run a practice that specializes in professional services for Microsoft security. So really where I've kind of carved out my niche is helping customers with what some would call the Microsoft challenge, right? Which is where no matter who you are, you probably have a ton of Microsoft stuff, right? And some of it, maybe their own security tools, right? So Microsoft offers security software. We help customers use that, understand it better, get their best bang for their buck. But then customers will also use Microsoft's non-security tools, right? So their productivity stuff, their CRM stuff. So we take that stuff that maybe isn't so secure by default and try and make it secure.
So, were you always technologies? Were you always dabbling in tech? Like, what was it something in your childhood that attracted you? What was the fork in the road that you and kind of taken to get you where you are? Because it sounds like you always were dealing with bits and bytes.
Yeah, it's early as far as my career. I've always been bits and bytes, and I guess, thinking back to childhood, I was always the prototypical computer nerd. It's like you get your first computer when you're a little kid, and I can remember it quite vividly. Actually, we had this old beige colored desktop, probably running very, very early version of Windows. Probably, I want to say Windows 2000 was probably my first exposure to the OS. And I remember we got this new hard drive, a whopping, I want to say 10 or 20 gig hard drive. And the idea was, well, we'll back up all our CDs to this hard drive. So we slap this hard drive in and nothing works. And you're like, okay, well, now I need to figure out how to format it and all the rest of it. And I'm doing this I must have been about, don't know, 7, 8, 9, something like that. And I guess that's when it kind of clicked for me. It was just like, oh, this is just a big problem to be solved. And then you just, you give up your social life and you just focus on IT for the rest of your time.
It's so interesting because you'd think to fast forward all those years. And by the way, I remember Windows 3.11, so so 2000 is not so bad. I think it started kind of, morph me to closely what it is today, or at least starting to. But isn't it amazing that, still when you plug in a hard drive, even today, it's still like you've been doing this for such a long time, and still we have very similar issues.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's in many ways the average user has a better time of it, right? In terms of just the skill layer for some things is reduced, but in other ways it hasn't. Like I think cybersecurity is still one of those things that the level of complexity that's involved in it, we haven't really moved on that far in terms of you still need to hire a bunch of people to become experts in this rather than just taking it for granted, right? And I think, I look to things like iOS and Android and, something they talk about a lot, the demise of the desktop and the rise of the tablet and all that. And I think in that regard, consumer IT has maybe become a little bit more friendly and easy to adopt for basically anyone. But enterprise IT, that's still as big and complex as ever, regardless of moving to the cloud or anything like that. At least that's what I see.
And do you feel that this is something that propelled you towards Microsoft? You could have just as well became a Linux expert or an Apple genius. And you think, what was there like the fork that you've taken to join into the kind of the Microsoft side of the house?
A good question. I just kind of landed here by chance, I guess. My first role in IT was a mostly Microsoft-based place that used a ton of Microsoft. Active Directory was omnipresent. There was actually a lot of IBM there as well. So familiarized myself with that. And I'll be honest, I just kind of liked what would you say? I like the fact that if you kind of focused on the Microsoft stuff, you could very easily perform a whole bunch of integrations and create platforms without having to, honestly, negotiate with a whole bunch of third-party vendors. And that made my life, if I'm looking at the kind of more management side of IT, that made my life a little bit easier because I had one point of contact and one license to renew rather than multiple vendors and going through that headache. And you can smooth those headaches out by working with the right partners and things, but that was certainly kind of one of the things that compelled me to it, was just the simplicity of kind of going all in. And sure, there's risks associated with that, but you do get some benefits as well.
Yeah, and I was Microsoft for many years until maybe about 2 years ago. I don't know, I said, okay, let me try Apple, and then I really liked it. And then again, I think I got enamored by the seamless integration between all the devices, the laptop, the mobile, the desktop. And so I switched. And it doesn't happen very often. It's like in cameras, you either Nikon or Canon, nobody's Fuji or whatever the case may be. It's the same as with Microsoft. Either Microsoft or your Apple. Like there's just almost like this. It's almost like you're a Democrat or liberal. Like there's nothing in between. There's no, and it's amazing that even though with that said, the enterprise itself. And you know what I'm going with this. The enterprise itself is really relying heavily on Microsoft. There's almost like a monoculture associated with it. And
yep.
We've seen that recently with the CrowdStrike, kerfuffle with the underlying update that broke all the systems. Talk to me about that. First, I'm assuming there was some impact to your clients, or maybe not. And then secondly, maybe you can... There's no better person, I think, than you to describe what actually happened. And then third, is there's a danger in that? Should we diversify? Should we reconsider having Microsoft as the basis for BL and then all for enterprise?
No, it's a good question. 3 good questions, I guess. So the first is I was reasonably fortunate enough as far as, because my specialism is actually Microsoft Defender, which is Microsoft's own CrowdStrike alternative. So I was quite fortunate to not have to be firefighting this, because most of my customers were on Defender for Endpoint rather than CrowdStrike. Though some of them do use CrowdStrike, and I know they had an awful lot of challenges, as you can understand. In terms of the actual, I guess the mechanisms and the causes behind what happened, and well, where do we go from here? Honestly, if I'm looking at it less as a problem to do with Microsoft's dominance of, everything from EPOS systems, front line facing systems through to back end servers and things. I look at it less to do with I wouldn't even call it a monopoly. I look at less to do with their prevalence there, and probably more to do with the organizational failings behind the supplier, i.e. CrowdStrike, that led to where we are. When you look at the play-by-play and the kind of detailed responses that CrowdStrike have since put out and explaining why this happened, there were just so many failures to have a proper, mature update management and testing system. And the real question is, to me, less about, okay, well, how did Microsoft allow this, or how did the Windows environment allow this, and more to do with, well, as the IT industry, as cybersecurity matures, geez, how do we self-regulate this rather than having to rely on the government doing that for us? And what I mean by that is when you compare the IT/cybersecurity industry to the banking industry or the legal industry or the energy industry that have been matured for decades, if not centuries, we are right in the embryonic stages of this, right? We're in the infancy of this industry. So I think it really just kind of acts as a wake-up call and a little bit of a shake there. Plus, it introduces a completely new disaster recovery scenario for us to consider, right? Where not only do we have to worry about the disaster of the adversary infiltrating our systems and bringing us to our knees, well, pure bad update management by our suppliers, no less. Because one of the things that in the early stages of the CrowdStrike outage, I kind of thought was, well, these organizations must not be doing update management very well. So for example, you should have your test devices and then you eventually roll that out gradually throughout your organization. Well, it turns out that regardless if you had that set up in place as a customer, CrowdStrike would have pushed this update to absolutely everyone regardless. So it makes me think, well, what are the kind of rigorous systems I now have to put my suppliers through to validate that I can trust their services on my most critical assets? So more questions than answers to me as a result of this.
It's super interesting because first and foremost, I don't think people, when they think Microsoft, I don't think they think security necessarily. They think platform, they might think gaming, but they don't think as a security company first. And maybe that's why some customers prefer to have a third-party protector or Microsoft as opposed to Microsoft protecting Microsoft. But there's maybe something to be said about who knows Microsoft best if it's not Microsoft. So why don't allow it to protect itself? But yeah, there's some questions asked about the kind of the supply chain and the ability to push in an update that wasn't meticulously tested. But isn't it the whole update and patch management thing that is slightly broken? We always talk about the Patch Tuesday, where people are afraid that something's gonna come up.
Yeah.
And they have an automatic update, yes, and if they don't, then they're completely outdated and they be vulnerable. What's your take on? Let's kind of stem from that, on updating and making sure that your platform is secure.
Yeah, it's always that balancing act where if you're talking about patching, so either through Windows Update or through your security software updates like your antivirus or your EDR, and we've seen this with CrowdStrike. Is that balancing act of wanting to get your updates continuously and fast enough to defend against new and emerging threats versus what we just seen, right, over the last few weeks. On the Microsoft side, for all its faults, and there is a ton of faults, every few months you seem to see a thing where it's like, oh, this new Windows update causes a blue screen under this type of specific scenario. Personally, I literally just had that where I got a BitLocker recovery screen because of a bad Windows update. They do a lot of things that if you're an organization and an IT administrator, that can help you minimize the impact and at least figure it out before it happens wide scale. So one of the things that Microsoft have done a really good job at, in my opinion, of preaching and encouraging admins to do, and they do this also through their training systems and qualifications, is the concept, it's kind of old-fashioned, but it's the concept of update rings, where I maybe have a ring 0, ring 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and maybe get my pre-production environment or my edge cases in ring 0, test that update, let it go for a few days, then move out to ring 1, ring 2, and ring 3. So there is a lot that IT admins can do to kind of take ownership of that, right? And sure, there will always be the risk that there'll be a bad update, and under your specific scenario, it might hit you. But using tools like Windows Auto Patch and Windows Update for Business, you can kind of control it a little bit better. But the problem is raising the awareness of this, right? Because it requires you to take that under your wing and put it through a lot of configuration and things. One of the problems we see quite often is that age-old thing of, well, that's the way we've always done it, right? And if I've always just said, okay, the updates come through and they flow through at just whatever pace Microsoft decides, it can be quite a cultural shift to then change that and think, well, actually, I maybe need to take on a little bit of the ownership myself, right? And test it on my own environment first.
And I think maybe the underlying complexity of it all, right? So let's assume that you're an enterprise and you standardize on Microsoft. There's just more to it than installing a, Windows server and installing Windows machines and then installing application in the cloud or premise or hybrid. There's quite a bit of complexity of starting to manage all of this. And we alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. And now you you also have to secure not just the underlying OS, but also the application itself. And so I'm assuming that, and a lot of people they don't come with this expertise, right? I'm assuming that that's why you come in and help out. So talk to me about maybe if somebody listening to this and is an enterprise Microsoft shop, talk to me about what you've seen that are the biggest caveats for creating some issues down the road with the Microsoft infrastructure. And then maybe the second question following to that, what would you suggest to start with for best practices to become compliant and from a security perspective?
Sure, great question. Look, it's the kind of recurring theme I've seen is over the last 10, 12 years, and it's accelerated since the pandemic, is organizations have rapidly moved to the cloud, and they could move to Google, to AWS, you name it, there's a cloud out there. And 365 is a big one, right? They moved from Exchange on premises into Microsoft's Exchange Online. Same for SharePoint. Teams is obviously a good example of that as well. And one of the main reasons customers have done that is to escape the complexity and risks of on-prem, right? So the risk of having to manage your own server infrastructure and keep that up and running. And we moved to the cloud on the premise that this would simplify our lives. And what we've really quickly discovered is kind of, I wouldn't say it's done the opposite, but you really just change the problem rather than eliminating the problem. And so the big problems that we see with that complexity in the cloud are the attack surface is far harder to manage, because as we've moved from really that network layer based security where I could wrap everything tight and nice around my firewalls and my VPNs, well, all of a sudden, if I'm in a remote hybrid work world and my identity provider is in the cloud, my data's in the cloud, unless you're properly managing identity security, all of a sudden the entire internet is kind of your attack surface, right? So for example, one of the big things we see, we do a ton of security assessments on the Microsoft side of things. One of the big things that we see is there will be zero BYOD controls within an organization. And what I mean by that is you may tolerate some BYOD. I think most companies at this stage will accept the risk of limited levels of BYOD. But we will see a lot of companies who have absolutely zero controls over it. And what you're doing there is you're really setting yourself up for a world of hurt down the line, because all of these Microsoft cloud platforms, by their very nature, they support BYOD out the box. And so what that means is I now have very limited control, traceability, and accountability over the flow of my organization's sensitive data to any device in the world. So as we've gained that advantage of being productive by being able to work on any device I want, at any time I want, from any location I want, well, again, out the box with something like Microsoft 365, there's nothing to stop me just going and downloading all my SharePoint files, all my OneDrive files, all my emails, all my CRM data, my ERP data, and just saying, I'm going to take that and put it on my home computer. And now when I exit the company, maybe I'm fired or maybe I leave on good terms, well, still, the company has completely cut the ties in their ability to revoke access to that data. And by far, that is the biggest challenge we see, is the lack of enforcement over the access to sensitive resources across any type of device. It's kind of become a bit of a free-for-all. And you have some organizations that I would describe as a bit more mature, and they are on top of this, but kind of bubbling away under there in the small to medium size enterprise. They just don't have the time and the resources to tackle problems like this. And that's where the kind of thing that I get involved in and help with folks out.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's almost like it created a false sense of comfort. When you went to cloud, you think, okay, there's somebody else who's now taking care of my security, but it's really a shared responsibility model, meaning that, yeah, they provide you the infrastructure, but it's up to you to secure those applications, right?
Yes, 100%, yes.
And it's really interesting that there were all kinds of, when you talk about BYOD, bring your own device, there were all kinds of technologies back in the day, and even today, one of them is like, for example, virtualization, right? In desktop virtualization, where you still have your BYOD, but you're really accessing the data remotely through an interface. So you really have nothing on the endpoint. Was that ever taken off, or what does Microsoft do in that regards? Or do they like leave it all to the end user to figure out, and hence like you come in? Are they aware of the problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they definitely are aware of the problem. To be completely transparent, I do think that, Microsoft is a for-profit organization, and the reality is they do paywall a lot of the controls that would protect against the biggest types of threat for this. So one of the big controls is called conditional access, and frankly speaking, that's your big BYOD security tool for Azure and for 365, but it requires an additional layer of licensing beyond what is available at the free tier. So there's that. I do think that it's very powerful, and Microsoft do promote it, but it's paywalled. On to your point about the kind of the virtualization aspect and things like that, Microsoft do have a solution for that. They've got a few actually. One, which is maybe the most common one, it's called Azure Virtual Desktop, which is, hey, if I support BYOD, you won't actually get access to our company apps and our company file shares on your computer, but you can remote desktop into the Azure environment, which hosts a little virtual server farm, and then you can use a virtual version of Windows 10 or 11, right, to access your data there. But again, this is where the security implications need to be fully thought through, is that provides some layer of security, but not complete security. So purely as an example, let's say I sign into my work's virtual environment, so I'm accessing my work's little virtual computer on my BYOD device. Well, if I have a piece of malware on my home device, okay, the malware can't exactly spread into the virtual environment, but if the malware is doing things like taking screenshots or taking keylogs or stealing tokens and cookies, that's still not a very great place to be in, right? And there's things you can do to protect against that type of thing. But again, it's going to be, in most cases, paywalled behind that higher level of licensing. And so look, these are the kinds of things that I don't look at security as being necessarily always right or wrong, but I just want folks to know the full risks, right? And acknowledge them. And then it's up to us to decide, well, is that trade-off worth it? Because in a lot of places, we don't have a choice, right? Because, I can't afford to buy everyone in my organization a device, right? So BYOD has to be supported. But it's just important that we make these informed decisions before we go marching ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about Microsoft, it's more than just the desktop or the endpoints. I would beg to differ, saying that I would say 95% of all enterprises hosted Exchange. It drives the world's email. And there's a whole ecosystem about protecting the Exchange, whether it's some email filtering or anti-spam or email security, encryption. There's so much. Talking about the ecosystem, the humongous ecosystem of not just the service providers like yourself, but this whole ecosystem of Microsoft add-on products, just like CrowdStrike, for example, but for the enterprise, all kinds of different tools that get on top of the stack.
Yep. No, you're right. There's a... You see it every year, and the number kind of changes, but you always see these statistics floating about, like, the average company has 30 different security tools or 70 different security tools, right? And email occupies a ton of those. So you've kind of, as far as Microsoft's concerned, actually, if you've got Exchange in the cloud with Microsoft, you get free levels of protection just included in your price, right? So they call that Exchange Online Protection, and it gives you your basic email security filtering, so malware, phishing, things like that. And month on month, it kind of varies in how good it is. It's a typical cat and mouse game. And then Microsoft do have a higher level of license if customers want it. They call that Defender for Office 365, and it offers some kind of neat little features. But what we also see really in the world of email is that third parties, they kind of aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So one example that comes to mind for me is there's a vendor out there called Abnormal, and they are doing some very cool stuff in the world of phishing protection. So, email has been around for as long as corporate IT has really been around, and yet it still remains such a prevalent initial access vector, right? Where it's that phishing email, either someone executes malware, or clicks on a phishing link, or literally just sends somebody money, right? And you have vendors out there, Abnormal being one of them, who are finally starting to leverage a lot of the, I managed to get the whole podcast without saying it yet, but they're finally able to leverage AI, right? There's those two letters. Where for example, we can say, okay, well, is this the type of language that the sender normally uses, right? So maybe this sender typically deals with me in very informal language, then all of a sudden they're being very formal. Maybe they typically sign off a certain way, but now they're not. So we can use that kind of pattern recognition for text and for email to just identify, well, is this maybe more likely to be a phishing email? And the other thing that is very promising with tools like that is the supply chain side of things, where, for example, one of the common ways an adversary will spread malware or phishing is they'll compromise a good mailbox and then send bad mail from it. So, for example, rather than spinning up my own email and my own infrastructure, well, I'll just compromise your email, and all of a sudden all your contacts, well, they trust you, and now they're going to trust me as the attacker. Well, a lot of the tools out there now, and Abnormal being one, is if it identifies a user's mailbox as being compromised, well, if I'm bought into that ecosystem, anyone who I now send email to, they will be able to be aware that my mailbox is compromised, and we can do things like pull the email out of their inboxes and all that kind of stuff. So look, there is a ton of progress in the email security world, but lo and behold, it is still...
It's a huge attack vector.
Oh, constantly. Absolutely.
Compromise, and there's just so much associated with it. So talk to me about when you do assessments. Maybe you can share some horror stories, some like maybe difficult conversation you had to have with clients, which I'm sure you did. And then the flip question to that is like, without hiring you, what would be like the first, 3 or 4, 5 things you can do to increase your level of protection with your Microsoft environment?
Great question. In terms of horror stories, listen, I'm not being funny, but most of them is the honest truth. And I don't say that, I say that with I say it with all the respect in the world, because it includes myself before I really started specializing in on it, right? It's that whole thing where it's like, if I was to look back at the recommendations and the way I did things, even as little as 3 or 4 years ago, on the one hand, I'm embarrassed by it, but on the other hand, I'm like, well, you know what? You're just doing the best you could. But the point is, there's so much out there that unless you are specializing in it, unless you're spending a ton of time in it, you just won't know, right? So the reality is, for most folks, they aren't in a good place, at least when it comes to cloud security. The most glaring examples of that are where you have organizations that aren't doing the fundamentals that kind of we all know by now. So MFA for me is the obvious example. We've known for over a decade now that MFA is kind of the lowest hanging fruit. It's not necessarily easy to implement. There's a lot of organizational challenge you'll need to go through, cultural changes, education campaigns, but purely in terms of mitigating the most number of attacks with the least level of work, MFA is massive. And when I see customers who are still dragging their heels there, that can be a little bit soul destroying. And where it's even more soul destroying is when it comes from the top down. So for example, I'll work with some customers, luckily not many, where there is kind of an executive-led decision to not do MFA because it's perceived as being too obtrusive or annoying or whatever. Yeah. And look, I get why you can't always do it, but you should do it for at least your most protected assets and things like that, right? So those are the big horror stories I see. And it's typical that those will change when there's an incident. And sometimes you have to put your hand on the hot stove to figure out you're going to get burnt by it, right? And I see quite a lot of that, unfortunately.
What about stories where you come in and you have 200 desktop or endpoints where they all have admin rights, for example?
Yes. Yep. That still happens. Absolutely. And look, it's one of those things. I do think Microsoft do have I wouldn't say they've got a whole bunch to blame here, but they share their fair share of it insofar as Microsoft themselves, up until, not that long ago, they also gave local admin rights to their internal IT, and then the Microsoft sales folks would say, hey, we've got local admin, why don't you just give your users admin? And so there's this whole cultural thing, not to mention the fact that once you've given that user that local admin right, pulling that away from them, they take it personally, right? You don't trust me, or, hey, I want to be able to do what I want. I get it, you know what I mean? I get it, but we just have to do a better job of conveying the security risks around that. And one of the questions you also threw out there was, well, what are some of the big things we could do, right? So in terms of security assessments, without someone like me coming in and holding your hand through everything, what are some of the main things I can do? And honestly, to me, off the top of my head, the first one that comes to mind is just know and control the assets that are connecting to your environment. And that's really simplifying it. I'm not saying it's easy, but at its core, that's the big one. You can allow BYOD, you can allow guest access, you can allow all sorts of access, but at least know and control it. So for example, if you're in the Microsoft world, make sure that only corporate devices can access your most sensitive accounts, things like that, right? Honestly, that protects against the high 90% of attacks, right? Your 98 or 99% of attacks are going to be protected by that.
Whitelist of devices that are allowed to connect. Is that enough? How you do that?
There's a few ways you could do it. That's one way. That would probably be your most secure way, but maybe not the easiest way. So one way that I really love to recommend folks is don't look at it as one size fits all. You can have different approaches. So for example, one of the things that's very common in a Microsoft environment is a tier model, where we take our most valuable assets, which could be our administrators' laptops, our domain controllers, the things that if an adversary were to get their hands on would be complete game over. But then, so that might be tier 0 or tier 1. And then maybe we've got things that are a little bit less important, and then maybe things that are a little bit less important still. And so you just kind of take that and you say, well, if it is our least important asset, we don't have to go full hardcore security on that. But for our most important assets, well, I need to apply as much fine-grained access to that as possible. So if I give you an easy example that your listeners and viewers might be able to implement straight away, within the Microsoft Cloud, there's a admin right that's called global admin. It's your God mode. You can basically do whatever you want with that role. What is a really terrific and usually simple thing to deploy, not easy, but simple, is we'll simply take that admin role and limit it only to known devices. So you just grab the UIDs or the GUIDs of those devices and you say, global admin can only sign in from these devices. And that means a bunch of things. It means that if the tokens for that account are stolen by an adversary and they try to use it on their device, they're not going to get access. It means if I have a malicious insider user who tries to do some stuff at home when they shouldn't have on an unmanaged device, they can't do that either, right? So it's about picking out these little bits of low-hanging fruit, but then also just constantly keeping in mind that just because I can't do this for everything doesn't mean I can't do it for the most important stuff. That's one of the key takeaways as well.
And what about implementing the endpoint? Is it Microsoft Defender? What's the free version? I mean, it's very good. It's for being a free option, is phenomenal. And I think because it does such a good job, because it takes the telemetry or the aggregation of all the millions of endpoints and see massive amount of traffic. So there's quite a bit of benefit from it, right? But some people don't even implement that, right? Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, you're right. So Windows Defender, or it's now called Microsoft Defender Antivirus, same thing. It's been included out the box with Windows 10 for a long time now. And you get really fantastic levels of protection with it. And I think the reason that the perception out there is that you need a third party, at least for the free tier, is historic reputational issues, right? We think back to Windows Vista, Windows 7, and we think of the Defender then, and we think how basic it was. It's a radically different tool now, primarily because it uses a component that they call cloud delivered protection. And what that means is it can use something called the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph, which is where Microsoft, the reality is They own the operating system. They own the telemetry. They know the prevalence of of the vast majority of executable files in the world, and then they can make a risk determination based on that. So for example, you take something like a Google Chrome. The executables for that will launch on hundreds of millions, if not billions of devices. So we can reasonably assume they're safe because it's executed so many times that there hasn't been a negative consequence associated with it. Whereas let's take something like a piece of malware. Now we know that most malware is kind of generated on the fly, so it gets a unique hash almost every time, certainly in the high 90% of times. Well, what we could do is, using Defender antivirus that comes for free, is we can actually say, you know what, don't let that execute until it has been uploaded to the cloud because it's a new hash, and then the cloud makes a determination and then allows it to launch. And you can do that completely for free. So, you know, if you're a consumer or someone that has to be very conscious of budget and you can't go out there and buy Microsoft's full enterprise Defender, or you can't buy a CrowdStrike or any of these other ones in play, don't sell Defender short. It is a very, very mature solution these days.
And let me ask you this. Isn't it the complexity, the added complexity from all these products creating, and one example can be, like, my God, Outlook and Excel and Microsoft, Word. The thing like exploded. I think most people don't use 95% of the features associated with it. And maybe some do, I don't know. But isn't it the complexity associated with these products is exponentially also increasing some of the security? Like, for example, in Excel, you can execute potentially malware through through code that you run. Some micro codes. Talk to me about the complexity, like the increased complexity of all software, and even Windows itself. How many millions of lines of codes is Windows 11 these days?
Yep. Yeah, no, you're right. The complexity definitely increases the attack surface for the Office platform that you mentioned. It's funny, hot off the heels as we were recording this, a company called TrustedSec out in the States, they just released a command and control tool that uses Outlook to achieve that. So Outlook and Excel, they have such a legacy of allowing insecure code to launch that adversaries, they love it. So for example, one of the things, spot on, if I can get through email, we were talking about phishing, if I can send you an Excel file and then convince you to launch the macro in that Excel file, well, all of a sudden I can launch all sorts of code, right? So adversaries love it for that initial access of things like ransomware, or even just getting you to hand over your credentials. So that massively increases the risk. There's a bunch of stuff you can throw at it, but again, it goes back to that point of, well, what is secure? What is the reasonable expectation for something to be secure by default versus someone having to tamper with it to make it secure? Now, Microsoft do have an initiative to make everything secure by default, but there's a ton of baggage there, right? There's a lot to overcome. Excel has made a number of changes to become more secure by default over the years. Like, it can't run macros that come from the internet now unless you really go out your way to allow it to do that. So we're seeing improvements there. But you're right, and one of the actual things we're seeing is for Outlook, Microsoft are kind of completely rebuilding Outlook now. They've got this thing called New Outlook. Personally, I don't particularly enjoy it. I'm stuck in my ways and I love that old school Outlook. But look, that's speaking to the complexity of taking on all that legacy code and the need to sometimes just burn something to the ground and start from scratch.
One would argue that these things are operating system by themselves. I would say Excel is almost an operating system. So is Outlook. Just say it's OS for email. It's OS for for math or for tables. It's really remarkable the size of these. And same is for Word. It's the OS for document creation. It is that complexity. You wrote a book that deals with some of the guidelines on how to defend. And it was like, 2.5 years ago. Talk to me about the creation of the book. Why did you decide to write it, co-author it? And, specifically, what value does the book provide to specifically for users?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Mastering Microsoft 365 Defender. It's all about Microsoft 365 Defender, which is their kind of enterprise, you could say, extended detection and response platform. So it covers in that book everything to do with protecting your endpoints, so Windows, Mac OS, Linux servers, through to email, Office 365, even your SaaS, your cloud, your third-party cloud, and also your on-prem AD. So it covers that full stack of how to protect against it. And honestly, the reason that I got on board with writing that book, it was just myself to start with, was when I started using Defender myself, I suffered so much because it was so big and so complex, and I just wrestled with this thing for weeks and months trying to fully understand it. And then I kind of got over that hump of thinking, okay, well, I think I've kind of cracked this thing. I get it. I've deployed it for so many customers now. I feel quite good about it. I'd love to make other folks' lives easier, and hence the book was born. And it was received quite well, luckily, because it was a struggle to put together that book. So it was good to finally get it out there.
Yeah, well, I would say the technical book is even one of the most difficult things to write. First and foremost, you got to make sure you're accurate, because you're going to be scrutinized by MVP like yourself, or the other ones who are going to basically tell you that maybe there's some things were not quite accurate. And then secondly, it's not like fiction. It's not like you get up in the morning and trying to make stuff up. You got to really, figure things out. So you feel that there's additional gaps right now? Maybe like writing, one more for, how to secure Outlook or how to secure. I mean, there's an endless gaps, I think, in the industry, specifically for Microsoft. Maybe there's some ideas for the next one, or maybe like you didn't like the experience, you don't want to go through it again.
Yeah, well, a couple of things there. One is that I'm very close to signing on to do a revised edition of it, so there will be an updated version, purely because the product has changed and the book needs to change as a result of that. But look, it's one of those things. You'll probably have this problem. I know a lot of folks have this problem. I have more ideas than I have time to actually do anything about those ideas. So I'd love to do a book about other aspects of security. The good news is there's a whole bunch of folks out there doing that, right? So Microsoft Security does have a bit of a close-knit community. There's a few of us out there trying to put out good material there and help folks out. So as an example, you mentioned kind of, securing Outlook and email things. Off the top of my head, Joe Stalker of Patriot in the States, he's got a book called, I think it's just called Securing Microsoft 365. And for your listeners and viewers, it's a fantastic resource for just generally how do I take this thing and secure it. It's very useful. But yeah, look, there's a ton of stuff out there, and like I said, I struggle with just figuring out, well, how can I take all these ideas I've got and having the time to invest into it. But that's why I do shows like this, because hopefully I can help some folks out.
How do you keep up to date with everything Microsoft? It's such a huge endeavor by itself, just to be specialized and figure out because think about the updates, the product features from just the Office 365 platform, or even just going after some of the enterprise software. How do you make sure that you're always on top of things, especially when you're dealing with clients? Is that like on-the-job training? Is it because you're dealing with maybe new deployments, or you? I know you're running a user group as well. Talk to me about that process of continuous learning. It's not enough to get the title MVP. You now have to, own up to it, kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. There's not a one thing I do. It's tons of things to stay up to date, and I don't think everyone should do this, because I'm the extreme. You know what I mean? You don't have to be as obsessively in the loop as I am. But as an example, one thing I would say is just very useful is just Twitter / X or LinkedIn. Social media, if you connect with the right people, it is fantastic for staying up to date with things, because folks just share what they find out, and then you just soak that up and you're like, okay, well, now I know something to avoid next time I do a project. So there's that. I also spend a ton of time. Microsoft have got something called the Message Center, which is basically anything that changes, they're supposed to post it there. It gets very busy. You could be dealing with hundreds of things a month. So I spend a lot of time crawling through that, digging out the details there, and then sharing it online. And then the other is I just jump in there and I just start playing with stuff and figuring out, hey, this looks different from last time I used it. Let me dig a bit more. It's just that kind of scratching that itch to constantly play about with it.
And some of the challenges sometimes, I'm assuming that, let's say there's a problem you can't solve, right? Or something that you come across and it's just stumble upon it. And it's sometimes super tough to get hold of Microsoft. Is, as an MVP, do you have like a secret hotline? And they're like, like that somebody actually answers the phone and says, hey, Ru, thanks for calling us. We've been, waiting for your call. Is there something we become that kind of samurai in Microsoft terms?
You get the old school red phone that just sits in your desk, and I pick up the red phone. There's a few avenues, right? Microsoft is, one of the reasons I love working with Microsoft stuff is the people there on the different product teams. They're fantastic at, number one, receiving feedback, but number two, just generally being available. I've been fortunate enough to make some friends and build a little network of folks that if I'm struggling with something, or I'm asking what's the future of this, or hey, has this changed, I can very quickly find that out. And part of that is nothing to do with the MVP. It's just through, like I said, things like social media, because a lot of the teams and the folks are out there and they're on social media. And if you want help, they'll give you, the time that a lot of people are willing to give away for free is nothing short of amazing. That said, through the MVP program, obviously you do get a few different kind of communication channels, and they've been very useful, but you don't have to get there to do that. Anyone can kind of reach out to these folks, which is great.
So Ru, I have two more questions, and it's been phenomenal. And then we part ways. So first, walk me through, when people are trying to get into the space in cybersecurity, I don't think a lot of people think MVP, that designation and becoming an expert in Microsoft security specifically. It's obviously you're passionate about it and been very rewarding for you. What would you recommend if somebody listened to this conversation to say, okay, this is something that I potentially can specialize in or learn, become proficient? What would you suggest that people do to follow your footsteps and becoming an MVP, and specifically specialized in Microsoft security?
A really good question. Listen, I guess if I kind of...
The people that are listening, to become an MVP, and what's the abbreviation for MVP?
I should know this. It's a most valuable professional.
Yes, it's like a VIP, but for Microsoft.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy process, right? It's not something you just pick off the shelf. That you gotta go through some serious training. So talk to me about that process, and I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, sure. So the process, one of the things that is commonly misunderstood about MVP is that it's a qualification or something like that. And in the strictest sense, Microsoft call it the MVP award. And essentially, it's less about what you technically know, though that is a big part of it, obviously. It's less about just being book smart and more about what you're able to give back and contribute to the community. That's the key thing. So maybe at the most in-person level, that could be speaking at conferences and presentations and user groups, podcasts, blogs, YouTube, things like that. It's about, well, how do you take what you know and help give it back to the community? That at its core is what MVP is all about. And look, the reality is, the way that I got into this, and the way a lot of folks get into it, is I started with a blog, and I wrote the blog as a way to force myself to learn stuff and get better. So it's kind of a win-win situation. I'm upskilling, and then as I learn, I'm blogging about it, and then other people get to benefit from that. And then you eventually get recognized through things like the MVP award scheme. And so if I was to kind of say, well, whether or not you're trying to become an MVP or you're just trying to get better in your career, improve your value, things like that, the main thing that jumps out to me is what really sets you apart is being able to suffer through the discomfort and the frustration and the awkwardness of not understanding something so that you can get to the point where you finally have that aha moment, and then you can take that big complicated thing that you struggled with it, simplify it, and put that out there for the world to see. Because number one, you're just becoming smarter and better yourself. Number two, you're demonstrating that for the whole world to see, which clearly helps your career and eventually gets you recognized by folks at the Microsoft MVP award scheme. So that's one of the big things that I try and encourage folks to try and do.
And absolutely. And one of the best things to know if you actually understand something is to be able to teach others. That's almost like the ultimate influence test if you actually understand this stuff, right?
100%.
So talk to me about the last thing. Let's plug in Threatscape. What do you guys do? What problems do you solve to your clients? And maybe just how the easiest way for people to reach out to you to know more about Microsoft in general, or specifically about security controls and so on.
Sure. So Threatscape, we are a Microsoft security partner. We don't just do Microsoft, we do all sorts of vendors. So Semantic, Abnormal, we do Wiz, things like that for CNAP. But Microsoft is where I lead a team of kind of crazy obsessive security consultants. And what we do is we really just help customers contend with the security posture of their Microsoft environments. We typically focus on cloud security, and that could be stuff like taking that E5 license that customers pay a ton of money for and making sure they're grabbing that license and squeezing every drop of value out of it so that, number one, their business can improve their productivity, but number two, so that as they do that, they can also remain secure and stay up to date against the kind of emerging threats that come out. And we do that either by implementing this stuff for customers or just by upskilling them, right? And making sure that you can take this on as your own internal IT team so you don't have to outsource it. So that's some of the big things that I get involved with. And we just won Microsoft Security Partner of the Year in Ireland, which we're very proud of. And one of the reasons we won that is because of the work we do, that thing we've been talking about throughout the whole show, which is that challenge of the cloud. You know what I mean? It's like this thing, it never sits still. It's always changing. There's a whole bunch of inherent risks to it. How do I deal with that? And that's something that we help hundreds and hundreds of customers with, and that's why we won the award. And it's a very fun place to work.
And you shouldn't be waiting, meaning, anybody who's running this in the cloud, the E5 license or whatever, it sounds to me like you should not be waiting for something to happen, or you could probably get the ROI on this almost immediate, right? From just to squeeze more from the licenses, and then also be able to sleep better at night, knowing that you're not going to be the next target or the next headline, if you wish.
Yeah. Yeah, spot on. There's a look that one of the things that kills me, I'm the kind of person that every penny's a prisoner, right? If I'm paying for something, I want to make sure I'm getting as much value out of that as possible. And one of the things that I love helping customers out with is really, really quickly helping them get massive security and productivity benefits out of that license that they didn't even know were sitting there, right? The stuff you get with these Microsoft licenses is tons. You feel like a kid in a candy store when you finally see it all. And so being able to take that, implement it, and do it in a safe way that doesn't kill the business, that doesn't result in productivity loss, but protects you against a whole bunch of threats, it's very rewarding. And to your point, it's just sitting there waiting for you to do it.
And before I ask you what's the easiest way for people to reach you, Ru, so we forgot to talk about AI, where Microsoft is going.
Yep, that's right.
AI, the agents, right? They're looking to add a, I forgot what's it called, the AI agent specifically for SOC analysts and so on. Where do you see AI going in the Microsoft ecosystem? I know that they're really pushed into it, but you actually start seeing AI or a version of AI implemented into the products as well.
Yeah, you're right. So Microsoft they've kind of got this brand now called Copilot, where there's a Copilot for this, that, and the other thing. There's a Copilot for Azure, Copilot for Microsoft 365, Copilot for Excel.
Ru, I just think about this little, I missed that little, you remember a paperclip? I don't know if
Oh, Clippy. Yes. Yeah. When you'd open Word and you'd start typing and a little Clippy would pop up saying, "Hey, can I help you?"
I read that. I wish they would bring it back.
Yeah. Well, sure.
AI version.
They kind of tried this not so long ago with Cortana. Sure. Remember, like Windows 10 would come with Cortana. So it's kind of, maybe this is the third generation of it. Maybe they'll get it right this time. But look, you're right. Microsoft are all in on AI. It's really hard to underplay how much investment they're putting into this and how much they're staking the future of the company on it. So Copilot will show up in everything. It has its strengths and weaknesses. So Security Copilot, which is the main one I'm kind of associated with, I don't quite think it's perfect yet. I think there's a lot of improvement to be done there. The good news is you can get in there with a reasonably low cost. You can test this thing out for very low cost. So figure out if it suits you.
Ru, is it like a Windows 7? Maybe yet? Or is it like XP?
Well, I see what you mean. It's oh geez, I don't know what comparison I would make it to. Yeah, I would kind of, I guess I would kind of like we were talking about earlier. I kind of said that, you know, the cybersecurity industry compared to a whole bunch of other industries is very much in its embryonic stages. I feel like we're right there with the co-pilots as well. And what I mean by that is long term, I'm very optimistic about it. But in the immediate term, the use cases are they're very few and narrowly defined, right? So it can do some things very well, but it isn't that generalistic tool that a lot of folks might be expecting. So my point is just, you know, keep the hype train in mind. Don't let your decisions around purchasing be driven by marketing. Have them be driven around evidence and your own testing and things like that. But look, long term, I am quite optimistic about the kinds of things that can help us improve.
Fantastic. Where is the easiest way to people reach out to you to know more about you, about the company?
Sure. So you can find myself on LinkedIn if you just search for Ru Campbell and look for the guy with the beard, or on Twitter. You can find me at RuCam365. And then you can find my company if you want to get some help with this Microsoft stuff at Threatscape.com, or just ping me on either of those social media platforms.
Fantastic. Ru, thank you very much for the conversation. It's been really great, and I learned a lot. And it's very evident that you're passionate about the topics as we discussed. And I urge everybody who's listening to reach out to Ru to know more and just get in touch. So thank you very much for joining me today. Much appreciated.
Thank you, David. Nice to join you.
And then for all of those who joined, thanks so very much, and looking forward to seeing you in the next episode. And until then, stay safe online as well as offline. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.